The letter arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. Hannah Wells held the fine paper carefully near the cottage window, letting the pale sunlight shine through it. The paper was far too elegant for someone like her. She could even see a faint watermark pressed into the surface, the mark of a noble house. Her fingers trembled slightly as she read the opening line. "Dear Miss Wells, I write to you not as a duke seeking a duchess, but as a man seeking understanding." Hannah read the sentence twice. For 3 months she had been exchanging letters with the mysterious Duke of Ravenshollow. His letters had surprised her from the beginning. They were not proud or formal like the letters of most noblemen. Instead, they were thoughtful, honest, and sometimes painfully vulnerable. Without ever seeing his face, Hannah had begun to care deeply for the man who wrote those letters. But now everything felt real. Her small traveling bag sat beside her chair. Outside, a hired carriage waited on the narrow road that ran past Thornfield Cottage. Today, she would meet him. Reverend Thomas Wells stood near the door, adjusting his worn coat while watching his daughter with quiet concern. "You are certain about this, Hannah?" he asked gently. Hannah folded the letter and slipped it into her small leather journal. "Yes, Father," she said softly. He studied her face for a moment. "The Duke lives far away. People say the place is isolated. Strange, even. I know what people say. And you have never met him in person." Hannah smiled faintly. "I know his mind," she replied. "Sometimes that is more important." Her father sighed, but placed a warm hand on her shoulder. "You have always been the bravest person I know. If this man deserves you, I hope he knows how fortunate he is." 2 days later, Hannah's carriage rolled slowly through the Yorkshire moors. The countryside had changed as they traveled north. The soft hills near her village had given way to wide open land. Wind swept across endless stretches of grass and stone walls that seemed older than memory. Gray clouds hung low above the moors. The driver pulled his coat tighter and glanced back at her. "You sure about this place, miss?" he asked. "Yes," Hannah said. The driver nodded toward the distant horizon. "Because we're nearly there." Hannah leaned forward and looked out the window. At first she saw nothing but hills and mist. Then the castle appeared. Ravenshollow rose from the dark earth like a fortress carved from the storm itself. Massive towers of black stone reached toward the sky. Narrow windows stared out across the moors like silent watchers. The castle looked ancient, powerful, and lonely. The driver muttered under his breath, "Well now, that explains a lot." "What do you mean?" Hannah asked. He shook his head slowly. "I've heard about this place. 7 ladies came here already. Fancy ladies from good families." "And?" "They all left within a day or 2. Hannah said nothing. The carriage rolled across the gravel road toward the towering gates. Wind swept across the empty gardens surrounding the castle. Once they had clearly been formal gardens, but now wild roses and ivy had grown freely between old stone paths. The carriage stopped. For a moment, everything was silent except for the wind. Then the massive oak doors of the castle opened, and Hannah saw him. The Duke of Ravenshollow stood in the doorway. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the straight posture of a soldier. His dark hair moved slightly in the wind, and his gray eyes seemed to study her carefully. Then Hannah noticed the scar. A thin, pale line ran from his left temple down toward his jaw. It was not ugly. It simply told a story of war, a story of survival. The Duke stepped forward as the driver opened the carriage door. "Miss Wells," he said. His voice was deep and calm. "You came." Hannah stepped down from the carriage and looked up at him. "Yes," she replied simply. For a moment they both stood there studying each other. The man before her was exactly as his letters had described. Serious, quiet, thoughtful. But there was something else, too. Loneliness. "Did you expect me not to come?" Hannah asked gently. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "7 other women came before you," he said. "None stayed." Hannah glanced up at the towering castle behind him. "It is impressive," she admitted. Impressive is a polite word for frightening. She turned back to him with a calm smile. "I am not easily frightened, Your Grace." Something changed in his eyes. "Then perhaps you will do better here than the others," he said. He stepped aside and gestured toward the open doors. "Welcome to Raven's Hollow." Inside, the castle was even more magnificent. The great hall stretched 3 stories high. Ancient banners hung from the wooden beams. A massive fireplace burned at the far end, filling the room with warm light. Portraits of long-dead ancestors lined the stone walls. Their painted eyes seemed to follow Hannah as she walked. "Your family?" she asked quietly. "Yes," Edmund Rothbone replied. He walked beside her through the hall. "My ancestors have lived here for more than 400 years. Hannah stopped before one portrait, showing a stern-looking duke in armor. "He looks like he could command an army," she said. "That was the 3rd duke," Edmund replied dryly. "Family legend says he tried to." Hannah laughed softly. The sound seemed to surprise him. They climbed a wide stone staircase together. Edmund showed her the chapel where his parents had married, the library filled with thousands of books, and the long portrait gallery that held generations of dukes and duchesses. Finally, they reached a quiet corridor. Edmund stopped before a large wooden door. "This will be your room," he said. He opened the door. The chamber was beautiful. Tall windows looked out across the moors. A large 4-poster bed stood near the fireplace, and fresh roses had been placed on a small writing desk. Hannah stepped inside slowly. "It's lovely," she said. "I am glad you approve." Edmund remained standing near the door. "Dinner will be served at 8, he said, "if you wish to join me." "I would like that." He nodded once. "Then I will see you this evening." After he left, Hannah walked to the window. The moors stretched endlessly under the dark sky. The wind moved through the grass like waves across the sea. The castle might have frightened other women, but Hannah felt something different. Possibility. That evening, she dressed carefully in her best blue gown and went downstairs. Edmund was waiting in the small dining room. Candlelight filled the room with warm golden light. When he saw her, he paused. "You look beautiful," he said quietly. Hannah felt her cheeks warm. "Thank you." Dinner was simple but elegant. Roasted beef, fresh vegetables, and wine from Edmund's family cellar. But the conversation was what truly mattered. Away from their letters, Edmund proved thoughtful and intelligent. He spoke about the history of the castle, about the tenants who lived on his land, and about the long years he had spent in the army. "You mentioned helping your father in the village," Edmund said. "Yes." "What does that involve?" "A little of everything," Hannah said with a small smile. "I teach children to read. I help organize food for families who need it. I visit the sick." Edmund listened carefully. "That sounds far more meaningful than many noble responsibilities." Hannah studied him across the candlelight. "You carry many responsibilities, too." "Sometimes it feels like I only carry the past," he said quietly. She shook her head. "You protect it," she replied. "That is different." Their eyes met. Something quiet and powerful passed between them. By the time dinner ended, Hannah felt more certain than ever that she had made the right choice. Later, Edmund walked her back to her chamber. They stopped at the door. "Good night, Miss Wells," he said. "Good night, Edmund." He looked slightly surprised when she used his name, but he did not correct her. Instead, a small smile touched his face. "I hope you sleep well." "Thank you for inviting me here," she said softly. After he left, Hannah closed the door and leaned against it. The castle was silent around her, but she did not feel alone. For the first time since arriving, she allowed herself to admit the truth. She was already falling in love with the man who lived inside these ancient walls, and she had no intention of leaving. The next morning dawned bright and cold over Raven's Hollow. Sunlight spilled across the endless moors and painted the black stone of the castle with soft shades of gold. For the first time since arriving, Hannah could clearly see the land surrounding the estate. The wild hills stretched for miles in every direction. Ancient stone walls cut through the grass like quiet lines drawn across the earth. Ravens circled above the towers, their wings dark against the pale sky. Hannah dressed quickly and made her way downstairs. She had always been an early riser. Life in a vicar's house had required discipline and routine. But when she entered the vast corridors of the castle that morning, she wondered if anyone else was awake. The castle felt different in daylight, less frightening, still mysterious, but beautiful in a way she had not noticed the night before. She followed the sound of quiet footsteps down the hall until she reached a large wooden door that stood slightly open. Inside was the library. Hannah stepped inside slowly and stopped in amazement. Shelves of books rose from the floor to the ceiling. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of leather-bound volumes filled the room with the soft scent of paper and ink. At the center of the room sat Edmund. He was writing at a large oak desk, his dark hair falling slightly across his forehead as he concentrated. For a moment, Hannah simply watched him. This was the man whose letters had filled her evenings with excitement and curiosity. The man who had trusted her with thoughts he had never shared with anyone else. She knocked softly against the door. "Good morning," she said. Edmund looked up quickly. When he saw her standing there, his serious expression softened. "Miss Wells," he said, "you are awake early." "I wanted to see the castle in the daylight," Hannah replied. "You are welcome anywhere in the house." He stood and moved away from the desk. "Would you like a proper tour? I realized yesterday I showed you very little. I would love that." For the next 2 hours, Edmund guided her through the castle. They passed through narrow corridors and wide halls, filled with centuries of history. He showed her the armory, where old swords and armor hung along the walls. He showed her the chapel, where sunlight streamed through stained glass windows and painted colors across the stone floor. He showed her a gallery filled with portraits of dukes and duchesses who had lived at Raven's Hollow long before either of them had been born. But the most remarkable place of all was the tower room. Edmund led her up a narrow spiral staircase that seemed to twist endlessly upward. When they finally reached the top, he pushed open a wooden door. The room inside was circular and quiet. Comfortable chairs sat near a fireplace. 2 large telescopes stood beside tall windows that looked out across the moors. Hannah walked slowly to the window. Then she gasped. The view was breathtaking. From the highest tower of Raven's Hollow, she could see the entire estate. The rolling hills stretched endlessly toward the horizon beneath a clear autumn sky. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Edmund joined her at the window. "This is where I come to think," he said. "The view helps clear the mind." "The other ladies did not like it?" Hannah asked. He shook his head slightly. "They found it lonely." Hannah smiled faintly. "I find it peaceful." Edmund studied her carefully. "You truly mean that?" "Yes." She looked out across the open land again. "This place feels free," she said quietly, "like standing at the edge of the world." Something in Edmund's expression softened. They stood together in silence for a moment. Then he spoke again. "Hannah, may I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you really come here?" The question surprised her. "I explained in my letters." "Yes," Edmund said, "but letters are safer than reality. You could have chosen an easier life. Why risk everything on a scarred duke living alone in a remote castle?" Hannah turned to face him. "Because the truth deserved to be spoken plainly. Because your letters showed me a man I wanted to know," she said. "Not a duke, not a title, a man who thinks deeply and speaks honestly." Edmund looked away toward the distant hills. "You may regret that decision," he said quietly. "The war changed me more than I like to admit." "I don't want the man you were before," Hannah replied gently. "I want the man you are now." Edmund looked back at her. For the first time since meeting him, Hannah saw real emotion in his eyes. "You are either very brave," he said softly, "or very foolish." Hannah smiled. "Perhaps both." Later that afternoon, Edmund invited her to ride across the moors. The air was crisp and cool as they rode across the open land. Hannah had grown up riding her father's old horse through country fields, and the freedom of galloping across the wide hills filled her with joy. They stopped beside an ancient circle of standing stones that had weathered thousands of years of wind and rain. Hannah stepped down from her horse and walked between the stones. "Local legends say druids placed these here," Edmund said. "They feel ancient," Hannah replied. She ran her hand across the rough surface of one stone. "Like the land remembers every person who has walked here." Edmund watched her quietly. "You see beauty everywhere," he said. "I see history," Hannah replied. He stepped closer. "You are not like the other women who came here." "Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "It is the opposite." That evening they dined again in the small dining room, but the atmosphere felt different now. Warmer, more personal. The conversation turned toward Edmund's years in the army. "You served under Wellington," Hannah said softly. "Yes." "Was it terrible?" Edmund was silent for a moment. "War is always terrible," he finally said, "even when it is necessary." "Is that where you received the scar?" He touched his temple briefly. "A French saber during a skirmish in Spain. You could have died." "Many men did." Hannah studied him carefully. "You survived," she said. Edmund looked down at his glass. "Sometimes surviving feels heavier than dying." Hannah leaned forward slightly. "The men who died would not want you to spend your life hiding from happiness." His eyes lifted slowly to meet hers. "You speak as though you know them." "I know grief," she said quietly. "In my father's parish, I have comforted widows and mothers who lost sons in the war." The silence between them deepened, but it was not uncomfortable. It was understanding. Over the following days, Hannah and Edmund fell into a gentle routine. Mornings exploring the castle, afternoons riding across the moors, evenings spent talking beside the fire. Each day, Edmund seemed to relax a little more. He laughed more often. He smiled more easily. One evening, as they walked through the portrait gallery, Hannah finally spoke the truth she had been holding in her heart. "Edmund." He stopped walking. "Yes?" "I love you." The words filled the quiet hallway. Hannah's heart beat wildly as she waited for his response. Edmund looked at her with an expression of deep emotion. "Hannah," he said slowly, "I love you too." He stepped closer, closer than he had ever stood before. The candlelight reflected in his gray eyes. "May I kiss you?" he asked softly. Hannah's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes." His lips touched hers gently. At first, the kiss was careful and uncertain, but as Hannah responded, it deepened into something warm and powerful. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing softly. Edmund held her hands. "Marry me," he said. "Hannah Wells, will you marry me?" Hannah smiled through tears of happiness. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Edmund, I will marry you." 3 months later, the chapel of Raven's Hollow Castle was filled with warm candlelight. The small stone chapel had witnessed centuries of weddings, baptisms, and prayers. Ancient stained glass windows colored the walls with soft shades of red, blue, and gold. At the front of the chapel stood Edmund Rothbone. He looked calmer than Hannah had ever seen him. His dark hair was neatly arranged, and his gray eyes held a quiet warmth that had slowly replaced the loneliness she first noticed when they met. Across the aisle, Hannah waited beside her father. She wore a simple but beautiful gown of ivory silk that had once belonged to Edmund's grandmother. The fabric shimmered softly in the candlelight, and the pearl necklace around her neck had been worn by generations of women in the Rothbone family. But Hannah felt no fear, only peace. 6 months earlier, she had been the daughter of a village vicar with a small life and simple expectations. Now she was about to become the Duchess of Raven's Hollow. More importantly, she was about to marry the man she loved. Reverend Thomas Wells stepped forward and began the ceremony. His voice echoed gently through the chapel. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Edmund Charles Rothbone and Hannah Elizabeth Wells." Hannah lifted her eyes toward Edmund. He was watching her as though she were the only person in the world. The ceremony felt both brief and endless. When the moment finally came for Edmund to speak his vows, his voice was steady. "I do." Hannah felt tears gathering in her eyes. Then her father turned toward her. "Hannah, do you take Edmund to be your lawfully wedded husband?" She did not hesitate. "I do." Edmund gently took her hand and placed the wedding ring upon her finger. The gold band had belonged to the Rothbone family for generations, but as it settled against her skin, it felt as though it had always been meant for her. Reverend Wells smiled warmly. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Edmund pulled her gently closer. "You may kiss the bride." The kiss was soft and full of promise. When they finally stepped back, Hannah saw happiness shining in Edmund's eyes. "I love you, Duchess," he whispered. "I love you too," Hannah replied. The wedding celebration was held in the Great Hall. For the first time in many years, the enormous room was filled with laughter and music. Flowers from the castle gardens decorated the long tables, and candles flickered warmly along the ancient stone walls. Edmund's closest friend from the army, Colonel James Morrison, raised a glass during the dinner. "To Edmund and Hannah," he said, "may your love be as strong as the stones of Raven's Hollow and as lasting as the hills that surround it." The guests applauded warmly, but the happiest moment of the evening came after everyone had left. The castle finally grew quiet again. Hannah and Edmund walked together through the corridors of their home. "This place feels different now," Edmund said. "It feels alive," Hannah replied. He stopped and gently touched her cheek. "You brought life back to this castle. And you gave me a home," she said. That night, for the first time, Raven's Hollow no longer felt like a lonely fortress. It felt like the beginning of a family. In the months that followed, Hannah embraced her new life with enthusiasm. She worked closely with Mrs. Hartwell, the castle housekeeper, to modernize the household. She established a small school for the children of the estate workers and spent time visiting families who lived on the land. The people of the estate quickly grew to love their new duchess. She was kind, practical, and never acted as though she were above anyone. But the greatest change happened within Edmund himself. Before Hannah arrived, he had lived almost entirely alone. The castle had been quiet and distant from the outside world. Now, everything was changing. Edmund began taking a greater interest in the lives of his tenants. He traveled more often to London to speak in Parliament about the problems faced by soldiers returning from war. Hannah noticed how his confidence slowly grew. One evening, they sat together in the tower room, watching the stars appear above the moors. "You have changed my life," Edmund said quietly. "You changed your own life," Hannah replied. "I only reminded you who you were." A year after their wedding, Hannah gave birth to their first child, a son. They named him Thomas Edmund Rothbone. Edmund held the baby carefully in his arms, studying the tiny face with wonder. "He has your eyes," Hannah said. "And your stubborn spirit," Edmund replied with a smile. 2 years later, their daughter Margaret was born, followed by another son named William. The castle that once echoed with silence now rang with the laughter of children running through the halls. Raven's Hollow had become a true home. But Edmund did not stop there. Remembering the struggles of soldiers returning from war, he began creating programs to help veterans find work and purpose. Some came to live at the estate and worked alongside the farmers and craftsmen who already lived there. Others helped teach skills in the school Hannah had built. Slowly, Raven's Hollow became known across England, not as a dark, lonely castle, but as a place of healing and opportunity. One evening, as Hannah and Edmund walked through the gardens, she asked a question that had crossed her mind many times. "Do you ever think about the other women?" she said. "The ones who came here before me." Edmund wrapped his arm gently around her shoulders. "Yes," he said honestly. "And every time I do, I feel grateful." "Grateful?" "Yes," he said. "Because if any of them had stayed, I would never have found you." Hannah smiled. "And if you had not written those letters, I would never have found you either." 5 years passed. One bright morning, Hannah sat at the breakfast table with their children, while Edmund read letters that had arrived from London. "Another request from the War Office," he said. "They want to expand the Veterans Program to several more locations." Hannah smiled proudly. "That is wonderful news." The work they had begun at Raven's Hollow had grown far beyond anything they imagined. Visitors traveled from across the country to see how the castle had transformed from a place of isolation into a place of learning and hope. Later that day, Hannah helped teach lessons in the small school she had built for the estate children. One of the younger students raised her hand. "Your Grace," the girl asked, "is it true that you met the Duke through letters?" Hannah laughed softly. "Yes, that is true. Will you tell us the story?" Hannah sat down beside the children. "Once upon a time," she began, "there was a lonely duke who lived in a great castle on the moors. He believed no one could love him because he carried scars from the war. So he wrote letters. And one day a girl wrote back. Did she love him? The child asked. Yes, Hannah said. She loved the man he truly was. 10 years after Hannah first arrived at Raven's Hollow, she stood once again in the tower room watching the sunrise. The moors looked just as beautiful as they had on her first morning there. But everything else had changed. Below in the courtyard, she could see veterans working beside estate workers. Children hurried toward the schoolhouse, laughing as they ran across the grass. Edmund walked into the tower room and wrapped his arms gently around her. "Good morning, my love." Hannah leaned back against him. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if I had not answered your letter?" Edmund smiled. "I try not to think about it," he said. "It is too terrible to imagine." He kissed the top of her head. "You stayed when everyone else left." "And you wrote the letter that brought me here," Hannah replied. They stood together watching the sun rise over the endless hills. The lonely Duke, who once believed no one could love him, had found a partner who understood his heart. And the simple vicar's daughter, who had dared to stay, had discovered a life filled with love, purpose, and adventure. Sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with grand gestures or perfect circumstances. Sometimes they begin with something simple: a letter, a choice, and the courage to stay when everyone else runs away.